For centuries, observers believed the spiral was a pattern moving through storms, rivers, railways, and human systems. They mapped it, recorded it, followed it across oceans and decades. But after the signal was finally understood, Eleanor Hayes saw something she had missed from the beginning. Every curve on every map had pointed toward a center. Not a place. Not a storm. Not a town. A person. And if she was right, then the man who had stood beside the pressure field for more than 250 years was not only near the spiral. He was the center it had always been turning around. In forgotten places, where wind carries memory, where silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. This is Whispers of Reckoning. The morning after the stranger said the spiral had only been the signal, Eleanor Hayes unlocked the Pine Ridge archive with a different kind of hesitation than usual. Not fear. Not even uncertainty. It was something closer to standing on a threshold and realizing the room beyond it might rearrange everything behind you. The courthouse square was quiet. The bakery had not opened yet. The diner windows still reflected the pale gray of early morning. A cool wind moved through the maple trees behind the archive, stirring leaves against the brick. Nothing outside suggested that the architecture of the mystery had changed. But inside the archive, Eleanor could feel it before she turned on the lights. For weeks, every question had pointed outward. What was the spiral? Where had it appeared before? How far did it extend? Who else had seen it? Then the silent network formed. The global spiral became visible. The decision line bent. And the stranger finally said the sentence that changed the shape of the pattern. The spiral was never the destination. It was the signal. Eleanor had not slept much after that. She spent the night in her kitchen with a legal pad, sketching versions of the spiral from memory and writing the same words over and over in the margins. If it was a signal, then a signal of what? If it was not the destination, then what lay beyond it? And somewhere just before dawn, as she redrew the oldest Atlantic records beside the newer global curves, she noticed something she should have seen earlier. Every version of the spiral, no matter how large or how incomplete, implied a center. That should not have been a revelation. Spirals, by definition, turn around something. But until now, she and everyone else in the archive had treated the center as abstract. A point of balance. A hidden geometry. A conceptual place where pressure gathered before redistributing. What she had not considered carefully enough was that every historical record of the spiral also carried another constant. The man in the plain coat. By the time Michael Carter arrived, carrying coffee and 2 folders of overnight messages from the silent network, Eleanor had already covered one end of the long table with new sketches. He stepped inside, set the coffee down, and stopped. You found something. Eleanor looked up. I think I found the question underneath the others. Michael walked closer. The table held copies of the Atlantic navigation records, London engineering notes, Pine Ridge storm reports, Harold Bennett's aviation log, Melissa Grant's Kansas City summary, and a fresh sheet with several hand-drawn spirals layered over each other in translucent pencil. At first glance they looked messy. Then Michael noticed what Eleanor had done. She had aligned each spiral not by date, not by geography, but by the point where witness language first mentioned the stranger. He frowned slightly. You moved the center. Eleanor nodded. No. I stopped pretending it was empty. Michael put the folders down and leaned over the table. Each spiral had a small mark near its innermost turn. Not a city. Not a system label. A notation. Figure present before recognition Atlantic, 1768. Atlantic, 1773. London, 1829. Alexandria, 1861. Pine Ridge, 1873. Wildfire photograph, 1911. Harold Bennett, 1958. Airport parking structure. Archive window. Decision line. Michael stared at the marks for several seconds before speaking. You think he is not only part of the pattern? Eleanor answered quietly. I think we have been treating him like a recurring witness when the record suggests something stronger. Michael straightened slightly. The center. Yes. He looked toward the wall map. The global spiral still curved across oceans and continents through the newest network observations. It had always seemed expansive, outward-moving, increasing in scale. But standing over Eleanor's layered drawings, he suddenly saw the opposite motion too. Every outward expansion depended on one recurring point of continuity. The stranger did not merely appear near pressure events. He appeared where the observer's understanding turned. That was different. That was structural. Michael spoke slowly. If he is the center, then the spiral is not only a map of pressure. Eleanor nodded. It is also a map of relation. Relation to him? Or relation through him? The distinction mattered, though neither of them yet knew exactly how. The archive computer chimed softly. A new message had arrived from Sofia Alvarez in Buenos Aires. Eleanor opened it while Michael skimmed the network summaries in the folders he had brought. Sofia's subject line read, Repeated Centerpoint Anomaly in Historical Reconstructions. Eleanor clicked immediately. Sofia had been running comparative overlays using the network's shared records and publicly available historic maps. Her note was precise in the way good analysts become precise when they do not trust what they are seeing. When historical spiral events are reconstructed by observer recognition timing rather than event location, a recurrent centerpoint emerges. It does not hold geographically. It holds relationally around the same recurring figure. Michael stopped reading his own papers. She saw it too. Eleanor nodded once, eyes still on the screen. Sofia had attached a visual reconstruction, several spirals layered not by latitude and longitude, but by what she called recognition onset, the point at which an observer first moved from unease to awareness after encountering the stranger's question, presence, or remark. The result was unsettling. The spirals did not collapse into a place. They collapsed into a person-shaped continuity. Not a body on a map, exactly. More like a recurring axis of perception. Michael took a slow breath. That is impossible. Eleanor almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. That phrase has not helped us much this season. He looked again. The stranger's presence was not the cause of the weather, not the source of the rail timing, not the generator of the pressure. But the pattern of recognition seemed to turn around him as if he occupied the inner point where observation became meaningful. Michael said what both of them were now thinking. If the world systems are the outer arms of the spiral, then he is where the meaning starts. The archive felt smaller for a moment, as if the walls had moved inward around the idea. Outside, the courthouse bell marked the hour. A truck moved along the square. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Inside, the architecture of the mystery was rotating again. Eleanor walked toward the wall map. And stood beside the newest pins from the silent network. Rotterdam. Osaka. Hudson Bay. Kansas City. Buenos Aires. The Pacific routes. The Black Sea. The network had always assumed it was mapping the spiral across the world. Maybe it still was. But maybe that was only half the truth. She turned toward Michael. What if the global spiral was never just pressure becoming visible? He watched her carefully. What else would it be? Eleanor looked at the old ledgers, the network notes, the evidence board with the man's recurring descriptions, and finally at the door through which he had come and gone so many times. A way of leading observers back to the same center. Michael said nothing for several seconds. Because if that was true, then the future of the silent network would not depend only on tracking lines of pressure across shipping lanes, rail systems, storms, and power grids. It would depend on understanding the one constant human presence around which the world had been learning how to see itself for more than 2 centuries. And somewhere beneath that realization lay a deeper unease. If the stranger truly stood at the center of the spiral, then the next question was no longer where the pattern would go. It was what would happen when the network finally reached the center and asked it to speak plainly. For most of the morning, the Pine Ridge archive remained unusually quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a small-town records room. A different kind. The quiet that appears when a group of people realize they may have discovered the question that sits underneath every other question. Eleanor Hayes stood near the long table studying Sofia Alvarez's reconstruction again. The visual looked deceptively simple. Several spirals layered across one another. But instead of aligning storms, shipping routes, rail corridors, or power networks, Sofia had aligned something more difficult to map. The moment when observers noticed. Not the pressure event itself. The instant when someone first realized something was wrong. Michael Carter leaned against the table behind her. You said Sofia aligned them by recognition. Yes. And the center stayed the same. Eleanor nodded slowly. Not geographically. Michael frowned slightly. Explain. She pointed to the earliest Atlantic reconstruction. The storm route Hale encountered in 1773 happened here. Her finger rested along the North Atlantic. But the moment he noticed the pressure pattern came. After the passenger asked him if the sea felt divided. Michael followed the movement. Meaning the recognition begins where the question appears. Exactly. She moved to the London reconstruction. The bridge pressure event occurs along the Thames. But the engineer's recognition moment begins when the stranger asks if he trusts the bridge more than the river. Michael began to see the structure forming. So Sofia did not map the events. No. She mapped the awakenings. The phrase felt strange but accurate. Each spiral event carried two timelines. The system event. And the human moment when someone understood the imbalance. Those two timelines did not always start in the same place. And when Sofia aligned the second one instead of the first, the spirals did something unexpected. They folded inward. Around the same recurring figure. Michael spoke carefully. If the stranger triggers recognition, then he becomes the reference point. Yes. But that does not make him the cause. Eleanor agreed immediately. No. She tapped the screen again. The storm still forms. The river still swells. The system pressure still builds. What changes is when someone sees it. Michael thought about the Kansas City corridor. Melissa Grant had already sensed the pressure before she spoke to them. But the conversation with the archive helped her frame the timing of the decision. Recognition sharpened action. The stranger did not create the storm. He accelerated clarity. The archive phone rang. Michael answered. Pine Ridge Archive. Kenji Tanaka's calm voice came through the line. I have been reviewing Sofia's reconstruction. Michael switched to speaker. Eleanor turned toward the desk. Kenji continued. I believe the center point hypothesis may be stronger than we first thought. Michael asked, what did you find? In rail dispatch archives, the moment of recognition often precedes the recorded delay by several minutes. Michael nodded. That is normal in human systems. Yes, Kenji said. But the earliest recorded recognition moments repeatedly follow brief interactions with unfamiliar individuals asking perception-based questions. Eleanor smiled faintly. The same method. Kenji continued. When those recognition points are mapped across different rail networks and decades, they converge in the same relational pattern Sofia described. Michael leaned forward slightly. You are saying the center point anomaly appears even outside our existing spiral records? Yes. Kenji paused briefly. Which suggests the pattern may be older and broader than our archive. Eleanor felt a quiet ripple of realization move through her. The spiral might not merely be a pattern in pressure systems. It might be a pattern in how human attention evolves. The stranger was not simply witnessing the spiral. He was standing where attention crossed into understanding. Michael looked toward the evidence board again. Then the spiral is not only about storms or systems. Kenji answered immediately. It is about perception. After the call ended, Eleanor wrote the word on the board. Perception threshold. Michael read it. And the stranger sits on that threshold. Eleanor nodded. Yes. The phrase changed the map in their minds. If the spiral described how pressure redistributed across the world's systems, then the stranger described something equally important. How recognition moved across generations. Storm watchers. Bridge engineers. Harbor clerks. Rail dispatchers. Pilots. Archivists. Network analysts. Each one becoming aware of the same structural truth in different centuries. Michael sat down slowly. So he is not the center of the pressure. No. The center of the noticing. Eleanor nodded again. The stranger had spent centuries appearing where awareness was about to expand. Not controlling events. Not directing systems. But preserving the moment when someone learned how to see. Michael spoke quietly. That is why he never stays. Eleanor looked at him. Explain. If he stayed, the observers would start relying on him. And the spiral would stop belonging to their judgment. Eleanor felt the logic settle instantly. The stranger had always left before the event closed. Before credit hardened. Before authority formed. Recognition had to remain local. Otherwise the pattern would collapse into obedience rather than awareness. Michael leaned back in his chair. He protects the independence of observers. Yes. And at the same time preserves continuity between them. The balance was delicate. Too much guidance and observers would stop thinking. Too little continuity and the pattern would vanish between generations. The stranger seemed to occupy the narrow space between those two dangers. Eleanor studied the evidence board again. Which raises another question. Michael waited. If he sits at the center of recognition, what exactly is he holding in place? Michael looked toward the spiral map. The global pattern still stretched across continents. The silent network was growing. Pressure events were appearing faster as systems became more connected. The world was entering a phase where recognition could happen earlier and across multiple systems at once. He answered slowly. The margin. Eleanor considered that. Margin between what? Michael gestured toward the spiral arms. Between pressure and collapse. Recognition widened that margin. It allowed someone to act earlier. To shift direction before systems locked into failure. The stranger's role suddenly looked less mystical and more structural. He preserved the continuity of that margin. Across centuries. Across observers. Across systems that had never previously spoken to each other. Eleanor looked again at Sophia's reconstruction. The spiral did not merely turn around the stranger. It turned around the moment when someone learned to see pressure before it was too late. Michael said what both of them were now thinking. If he is the center of recognition. Eleanor finished the thought. Then the silent network might become the first generation that does not need him. The sentence sat in the room like a delicate object neither of them wanted to move too quickly. Because if it was true, then the stranger's centuries-long role might be approaching its conclusion. Not through disappearance. Through fulfillment. The archive computer chimed again. Another message from Sophia. This one contained only a short line beneath the updated spiral reconstruction. If the center stabilizes recognition, what happens when recognition stabilizes itself? Eleanor read the sentence twice. Then she looked toward the archive door. The stranger had not appeared that morning. Not near the window. Not near the courthouse square. Michael followed her gaze. You are wondering if he already knows. Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes. Michael stood and walked toward the spiral map. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge weeks earlier, he felt as if the mystery was no longer pointing backward through history. It was pointing forward. Toward a moment when the spiral might no longer need a single center. Because recognition itself had become distributed. And if that moment arrived? He turned back toward Eleanor. Then the spiral changes again. Outside the archive windows, sunlight moved across the courthouse square. Ordinary morning. Ordinary town. But inside the archive the pattern that had once hidden itself inside storms and rivers was now approaching something even more difficult to understand. Not where it came from. But what it would become once the observers finally reached the center. By midday the Pine Ridge archive no longer felt like an isolated records room. For the first time since Eleanor Hayes unlocked the building years earlier, the archive had become something closer to a control room for attention. Not control of systems. Not control of storms. Control of awareness. Across several continents, observers connected through the silent network were now comparing recognition moments in real time. Shipping irregularities. Energy load fluctuations. Rail timing compression. Weather corridors tightening unexpectedly. Each observer still worked within their own system. But now the first sign of imbalance no longer remained local. The moment someone noticed pressure, the information traveled. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But fast enough to widen the margin where decisions could still matter. Michael Carter stood near the spiral map on the wall, watching the latest reports arrive. Osaka had detected a minor rail timing drift earlier than expected. Rotterdam had flagged a shipping corridor that began compressing departure windows. Buenos Aires had reported a short-lived energy load anomaly. None of them were dangerous alone. But what caught Michael's attention was the timing. They were arriving closer together than the historical record suggested they should. Eleanor noticed his expression. What is it? Michael tapped 3 points on the map. Look at the spacing. Eleanor stepped closer. The events were not clustered geographically. They were distributed across the network. Yet the recognition times were separated by only minutes. Historically, similar pressure events often appeared days apart. Sometimes weeks. But now they were compressing. Kenji Tanaka's voice came through the speaker. We are observing the same pattern here. Michael leaned toward the phone. What is your interval? 4 minutes between signals, Kenji said. Michael looked at Eleanor. 4 minutes. Eleanor frowned. That is too fast. Michael nodded. Historically the spiral moved slower because systems were slower. Shipping lanes required days to cross oceans. Rail networks were regional. Storm observations traveled by paper and telegraph. But the world had changed. Modern infrastructure was synchronized. Global logistics moved continuously. Digital communication compressed distance. And that meant pressure patterns could propagate faster too. Eleanor spoke quietly. The spiral is adapting to system speed. Michael nodded. Yes. Another message arrived. Sofia Alvarez. Her voice carried a different tone than usual. Michael, Eleanor, you need to see this. The screen displayed a new reconstruction. Sofia had overlaid recent network observations onto the historic spiral model. At first the result looked like an ordinary extension of the pattern. But then the difference became obvious. The arms of the spiral were tightening. The curve that once stretched gradually across decades was now compressing into much shorter time intervals. Eleanor whispered. It is accelerating. Sofia confirmed. Not geographically. Temporally. Michael crossed his arms. Meaning the pattern is not spreading faster across the world. It is repeating faster within it. Eleanor looked back at the wall map. More pressure events. More recognition moments. Closer together. Kenji spoke again from Osaka. This may be an unavoidable consequence of global system connectivity. Michael understood immediately. The spiral had always been tied to pressure redistribution. But the number of interacting systems on Earth had multiplied dramatically over the last century. Air traffic. Energy grids. Digital networks. Automated logistics. Weather forecasting systems. Financial timing. Every layer added more points where pressure could accumulate. Which meant the spiral had more opportunities to appear. Eleanor said the thought out loud. The world has become dense enough for the pattern to repeat faster. Michael nodded slowly. And the network may not be ready for that speed yet. The archive phone rang again. Melissa Grant. Kansas City. Michael answered. What are you seeing? Melissa spoke quickly. Minor corridor compression again. Nothing like last night, but the timing drift appeared suddenly. Michael checked the clock. The previous recognition signal had arrived from Rotterdam less than 3 minutes earlier. He asked, did you notice it before the software? Yes, Melissa said. Just barely. Eleanor wrote the time down. The margin was shrinking. Recognition still arrived before system lock. But the gap was getting smaller. Michael felt the pressure of the realization forming. If the spiral accelerates faster than observers can recognize it, the margin disappears. Eleanor looked toward him immediately. And the network becomes reactive instead of anticipatory. Michael nodded. The entire strength of the silent network depended on early recognition. The moment observers began noticing pressure too late, the system would collapse back into historical patterns. Redistribution without preparation. Correction without margin. The archive fell silent for a moment. Then Sophia spoke again. There may be another explanation. Michael waited. What? Sophia zoomed in on the spiral reconstruction. You are assuming acceleration is purely structural. Eleanor frowned. What else could it be? Sophia hesitated before answering. Learning. Michael blinked. Explain. If observers across the network are becoming better at recognizing pressure earlier, then the recognition signals may appear closer together simply because more of them are being detected. Eleanor considered that carefully. So the spiral may not be accelerating. It may be becoming visible. Michael nodded slowly. Both explanations could exist simultaneously. More system complexity meant more pressure points. Better observers meant more recognition events. Either way, the world was entering a phase where spiral moments would occur far more frequently. Michael looked again at the evidence board. For centuries the stranger had preserved recognition one observer at a time. Now recognition was multiplying. Distributed. Shared. Amplified. And that raised a difficult possibility. If the network truly became capable of recognizing pressure independently, what role remained for the man who had once stood at the center of that awareness? Eleanor voiced the question quietly. Where is he now? Michael glanced toward the archive door. He has not appeared today. Eleanor folded her arms. He appears when recognition needs guidance. Michael nodded. But today the network is guiding itself. The idea felt both encouraging and unsettling. The stranger had preserved the margin for centuries. Now the margin might be sustained collectively. But that also meant the network carried a responsibility no previous generation of observers had faced. Not simply noticing. Coordinating. Across systems. Across time zones. Across human judgment. Michael walked to the spiral map. The pattern no longer looked like a historical curiosity. It looked alive. Dynamic. Growing more complex with every new connection humanity created. He spoke quietly. If the spiral is speeding up, the network has two choices. Eleanor looked toward him. What choices? Michael pointed to the map. We either learn to recognize pressure faster. He paused. Or the world will teach us the hard way again. Outside the archive windows, the afternoon sun moved slowly across the courthouse square. Cars passed. People walked. Ordinary life continued. But inside the Pine Ridge archive, the observers had just crossed another invisible threshold. For centuries the spiral had been something the world discovered too late. Now the world had begun seeing it early. And that meant the future of the pattern would depend not only on pressure, storms, or systems. It would depend on how quickly people learned to recognize the moment when a line could still bend. Because the spiral had been the signal. And now the signal was repeating faster than ever before. By late afternoon the spiral map inside the Pine Ridge archive had become almost unrecognizable compared to the quiet pattern Eleanor Hayes first discovered weeks earlier. New marks had begun appearing faster than anyone expected. Not disasters. Not even close calls. Recognition signals. Small observations. Arriving from observers across the silent network. Rotterdam. Osaka. Buenos Aires. Hudson Bay. Western Pacific flight corridors. Kansas freight exchanges. Weather monitoring stations across the Rockies. Each message carried the same tone. Something felt slightly off. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. But pressure was gathering across several systems at once. Michael Carter stood beside the wall map with a pencil in his hand, marking recognition times beside each new signal. Then he stepped back. Eleanor noticed immediately. What is it? Michael tapped the pencil against the board. They are lining up. Eleanor moved closer. At first it looked random. But then she saw it. The recognition signals were forming a curve. Not across geography. Across time. Each observation appeared within minutes of the last. Rotterdam. 3 minutes later, Osaka. 2 minutes later, Kansas City. 4 minutes later, Buenos Aires. Then another signal from the Pacific weather corridor. The intervals were shrinking. Eleanor whispered, the spiral again. Michael nodded. But this time the pattern was not spreading across continents. It was tightening around a single moment. Kenji Tanaka's voice came through the speaker. I am seeing rail pressure propagation across 3 dispatch zones. Melissa Grant added from Kansas City, freight corridor margins are shrinking again. Sofia Alvarez spoke next. Energy load fluctuation across southern grids. Each report alone sounded manageable. But together they suggested something far more complicated. Not one system approaching imbalance. Several systems drifting toward it simultaneously. Michael drew a circle around the newest cluster of signals. This is different from Kansas City. Eleanor asked quietly, how? Last time we had one corridor. Michael tapped the map again. Now we have a convergence. Shipping timing. Rail corridors. Energy load. Weather pressure. Data traffic fluctuations. The systems were not collapsing. They were aligning. Kenji spoke again. If the compression continues, the redistribution could propagate across multiple infrastructures at once. Eleanor understood what he meant. The spiral had always marked moments when pressure shifted direction. But if several major systems reached redistribution simultaneously, the outcome would not be a single bent corridor. It would be a cascade. Not catastrophic necessarily. But disruptive. Large enough to ripple across the global network. Michael studied the timestamps. They are accelerating. Sophia answered. I see it too. The archive computer displayed the newest signal. Aviation corridor pressure over the western United States. Michael inhaled slowly. The spiral had begun intersecting the same airspace where he first noticed the radar pattern weeks earlier. The coincidence was unsettling. Eleanor asked the question none of them wanted to say out loud. How much margin do we have? Michael looked at the timestamps again. Less than 15 minutes. The room went quiet. The silent network had never faced a pressure event of this scale before. The Kansas City corridor involved one regional system. This convergence involved several. Kenji spoke carefully. If the network does nothing, the systems will redistribute on their own. Michael nodded. They always do. But the correction will be rough. Eleanor looked at the spiral map. So we widen margin again. Michael hesitated. That may not be possible with one decision. The previous spiral events had hinged on small adjustments. A course change. A rail delay. A 6-minute freight corridor shift. But now several systems were drifting simultaneously. One small decision might not reach all of them in time. Another signal arrived. Hudson Bay shipping route. Michael circled it. The curve tightened. The spiral arms were folding inward faster than the network could respond. Eleanor felt the weight of the realization forming. The spiral is closing. Michael nodded. And the center is forming. The room suddenly felt smaller. Because they both knew what the center implied. Recognition. Choice. The moment when pressure could still bend before locking into cascade. The archive door opened quietly. Neither Eleanor nor Michael had heard footsteps approach. But when they turned, the stranger stood just inside the doorway. Plain coat. Dust on the boots. Calm expression. As if the room had been expecting him. Michael exhaled slowly. You felt it too. The stranger nodded once. The pressure field is aligning. Eleanor gestured toward the map. The network is already responding. The stranger walked closer to the spiral board. His eyes moved across the marks quickly. Recognition signals. Timing intervals. System overlaps. Then he said something that made both of them go still. This is the first time the spiral has closed with observers already connected. Michael understood immediately. Every historical spiral event had happened before observers could coordinate across systems. Now the silent network existed. Which meant the redistribution would not depend on a single observer. It could depend on many. Eleanor asked quietly, can the network widen margin across multiple systems? The stranger looked at the spiral. Yes. Michael frowned slightly. But not by controlling them. No. Then how? The stranger turned toward the map again. Recognition must move faster than pressure. Eleanor felt the meaning unfold. The network could not command systems. But it could warn observers earlier. If each system received recognition signals before their internal corrections hardened, then small adjustments across multiple locations could widen the global margin. Michael nodded slowly. A distributed response. Kenji spoke through the speaker. I agree. Sophia added, if each observer widens margin locally, the cascade dissolves. Melissa's voice followed. We need timing. Michael stepped toward the desk. Then we coordinate. He looked toward the stranger. The man did not offer instructions. He simply watched. Exactly as the historical records had always described. Present at the center. But not controlling the decision. Michael spoke into the network channel. Everyone listened carefully. Across several continents, observers paused. Shipping offices. Rail dispatch centers. Energy monitoring rooms. Weather stations. Freight corridors. Michael continued. The spiral is closing. But this time we are not isolated. He pointed to the spiral map though only Eleanor and the stranger could see it. Each of you widen margin in your own system. Small adjustments only. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to slow pressure. Kenji answered first. Rail delays of 30 seconds across 3 junctions. Melissa followed. Freight corridor stagger adjustments. Sophia. Grid load balancing earlier than scheduled. Lena in Rotterdam. Shipping departure spacing. Michael listened as each observer confirmed a small action. Not commands. Decisions. Local knowledge applied at the right moment. The spiral on the board seemed to pause. The curve loosened slightly. Then another signal appeared. But this time the interval stretched. 4 minutes. 5 minutes. 7. Eleanor looked at the stranger. The margin is widening. He nodded. Michael waited. Then slowly lowered the pencil. The spiral did not vanish. But it stopped tightening. The cascade had dissolved into smaller corrections across multiple systems. Distributed recognition had worked. The silent network had bent a global pressure event together. The room fell quiet again. Michael looked toward the stranger. For centuries this would have required a single observer. The stranger nodded. Yes. Eleanor looked at the network map. But now the center is shared. The stranger's expression softened slightly. Outside the archive windows, the sun had begun to lower toward the horizon. A warm light spread across the courthouse square. The pressure field had eased. The spiral had bent again. But this time, the center had not been a single person. It had been the network itself. For a long moment after the pressure signals began spreading farther apart, no one inside the Pine Ridge archive spoke. Not because they were uncertain. Because they were listening. Across several continents, observers inside the silent network were still making small adjustments inside their own systems. Rail corridors widened departure spacing. Shipping schedules shifted by minutes. Energy loads redistributed gradually instead of abruptly. Weather monitoring stations adjusted forecast thresholds. None of the actions were dramatic. None of them would appear in headlines. But together they had done something no generation of observers had ever done before. They had widened margin across the world at the same time. Michael Carter watched the spiral map carefully. The tightening curve that had begun forming an hour earlier had softened. Not disappeared. But loosened. The intervals between recognition signals were growing again. 4 minutes. 7 minutes. 12. The pattern was stabilizing. Eleanor Hayes leaned lightly against the long table where the old ledgers rested beside the new notes from the silent network. For 2 centuries those ledgers had recorded moments when observers acted alone. A navigator adjusting course. An engineer halting construction. A dispatcher delaying a train. A pilot shifting heading. Each decision widening margin inside one small part of the world. But what had just happened inside the archive was something entirely different. For the first time, observers across multiple systems had acted together before pressure hardened into cascade. The spiral had bent. Not because one person stood at the center. Because many did. Eleanor looked toward the stranger. He was standing near the spiral map again. Not studying it closely. Just watching. The same posture witnesses had described for centuries. Calm. Present. Attentive. As if the moment unfolding had always been expected. Michael spoke quietly. It worked. The stranger nodded. Yes. Michael gestured toward the map. For the first time the spiral closed with distributed recognition. The stranger turned slightly toward him. Not closed. Michael frowned. What do you mean? The man stepped closer to the board and placed one finger near the outer curve of the spiral Eleanor had drawn earlier that morning. A spiral does not end when it bends. His finger traced the line inward slowly. It begins again. The sentence settled across the room with quiet weight. Eleanor understood before Michael spoke. You mean the pattern continues? Yes. But now it continues differently. Michael looked again at the map. For centuries the spiral had depended on isolated observers. Recognition passed quietly from one generation to another through chance encounters, handwritten notes, and margin records. But now something fundamental had changed. The silent network existed. Recognition no longer traveled slowly. Observers could share awareness across systems and continents within minutes. The center of the spiral was no longer a single point. It had become distributed. Michael spoke slowly. So the network becomes the new center. The stranger nodded once. Eleanor felt the meaning settle deeply. For generations the man in the plain coat had stood at the edge of pressure fields asking the questions that helped observers notice. Now the network itself had begun doing the same thing. Recognition was spreading. Observers were helping one another see. The role the stranger once carried alone was now being shared by many. She asked quietly, "What happens to you now?" The stranger's expression did not change. But something in his eyes softened. For centuries I helped preserve the moment before recognition. He gestured toward the archive. Now the moment preserves itself. Michael crossed his arms thoughtfully. You are saying the network does not need you anymore. The stranger considered the words carefully before answering. Need is not the right word. Eleanor understood. You are no longer the only center. The stranger nodded. Yes. For the first time since Eleanor had met him in the archive weeks earlier, the mystery surrounding him seemed to loosen. Not disappear. But become less necessary. His role had never been to control events. It had been to keep the possibility of recognition alive until the world became connected enough to sustain it. That moment had finally arrived. Michael glanced toward the spiral map again. What we saw today will not be the last time the spiral tightens. No, the stranger said. The world is becoming more complex. Which means more pressure. And more decisions. Eleanor added quietly, and more observers. The stranger smiled faintly. Exactly. Outside the archive windows, the sun had dipped lower over the courthouse square. Evening light stretched across the brick walls and maple trees. The town continued as it always had. A few cars passed. Someone walked a dog along the sidewalk. Ordinary life moving quietly forward. But inside the archive the meaning of those ordinary moments had expanded. Because somewhere in the systems that supported that quiet life, power grids, freight corridors, rail timing, weather monitoring, people were now paying closer attention. The silent network was no longer a fragile experiment. It had acted. And the spiral had answered. Michael stepped toward the long table and picked up Harold Bennett's compass again. The faint spiral carved into the metal ring caught the light from the window. For weeks the symbol had represented mystery. Now it represented continuity. The pattern had always been there. But recognition had changed. He placed the compass beside the newest ledger Eleanor had begun earlier that day. Old observers. New observers. The same pattern connecting them. Eleanor closed the ledger gently. For 2 centuries the spiral was something people discovered too late. Michael nodded. But now. She looked toward the network map. Now we may see it early enough to shape what happens. The stranger moved toward the door. Neither Eleanor nor Michael tried to stop him. They understood something now that had not been clear before. He had never been meant to stay. The stranger paused at the doorway and looked back once more at the archive. The ledgers. The spiral map. The evidence board. The 2 observers who had helped awaken a network. Then he spoke one final time. The center of the spiral was never a place. Michael waited. The stranger continued. It was the moment someone learns to see. Eleanor felt the truth of that sentence settle across everything she had studied for weeks. Storms had always existed. Rivers had always flooded. Systems had always gathered pressure. But history changed when someone recognized the pattern before it was too late. That moment, the instant when attention arrived early enough, was the real center. And now the world had many such centers. The stranger stepped outside into the evening light. His footsteps crossed the courthouse square slowly, exactly as witnesses had described across centuries. Plain coat. Dust on boots. Calm pace. A presence that did not demand to be followed. And for the first time since the archive records began mentioning him, Eleanor did not feel as though something mysterious had just left the room. Instead, it felt like something had been handed over. Michael looked toward the empty doorway. You think we will see him again? Eleanor thought about that carefully. The spiral would continue. Pressure would gather. Observers would still face moments when recognition mattered. So the answer was not simple. Finally she said, I think we will recognize him when we need to. Michael nodded slowly. Outside the sky had begun turning gold above the courthouse roof. The town of Pine Ridge remained quiet. But the world beyond it had changed in a subtle and important way. For centuries the spiral had been a signal waiting for someone to understand it. Now the signal had been heard. And recognition no longer belonged to one quiet traveler standing at the edge of pressure. It belonged to a network of observers learning how to listen together. In forgotten places, where wind carries memory and silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to Whispers of Reckoning. The spiral was never the end of the story. It was the signal. And once enough people learn to see it, the center of the spiral is no longer a mystery. It is every moment someone notices in time. Pressure gathers. Until someone listens. And every act leaves an echo.